In soft-image exercise, we have several different methods of multiplying objects or copying objects. They're all to be found under the Edit menu, under Duplicate, Instantiate. And you see we have a whole bunch of different things here. So actually we have three distinct different methods. It's the duplication, cloning, and instantiation. So I'll just go through them one by one and explain the differences here. So first of all, duplicate. I can do this by hitting just D and planting a click somewhere, and it'll just make a copy of the selected item wherever I click. Now, if I actually look at this object, it's a geometric object with everything that you'd expect. I can modify the topology here, go in, do some sort of nonsense, and I can also change the original, but it won't actually propagate down to the duplicates of it. So that's the main difference between that one and the second form which I have, which is clone. So if I grab this guy, have it selected, go into Duplicate, Instantiate, Clone Single, it'll create a clone of this, which now is also modifiable, so I can go in here and select the geometry and all that sort of thing. But I can also select my original, change it, and you'll see that the changes are propagated down to the clones. So that's the big difference between cloning and duplicating. Now both of these forms have one big disadvantage in that they're creating physical copies of the geometry. Whether it's with the propagation or without, it still is taking a lot of memory. So the third possibility we have here is instantiation. What instantiation does, it requires you to actually have a model of the object, so we'll just go to that and create a new model and call it cone maybe. Okay, there we go, and if we look in our Explorer, we now have a model cone with the cone underneath it. So if I have this guy selected and I create instantiate single, there we go, and just move this down here, what we now have is we have what's called an instance. And a geometric instance is a copy of the first one, but without a lot of the unnecessary information in memory. So for example, I can actually go in here and change the geometry of the instance, but if I change the original, it will propagate down to the others. Now, where it's useful for is having many identical objects in your scene, maybe nuts, bolts, that sort of thing, or maybe many different objects and scales or anything like that. You can just use a geometric instancing because it'll have a very small memory and resource footprint in the scene. Okay, now you'll see we have a couple other guys down here, such as duplicate, instantiate, options, and all that sort of thing. Maybe we should talk a little bit about those. So let's just grab a duplicate multiple, and that'll bring up my duplication and instantiation options. There we go, options. And basically what this will do is it will ask me several possibilities retaining information from my original, such as, for example, the history, the property sets, animation, if I want the duplicates to be selected or just the original, anything like that. I have a lot of possibilities of actually going in there and selecting different things there. And the other one, of course, is how many copies do I want. If that's not enough, I can always go there and enter a new number. And finally, what we also have is transform. So if I wish to automatically transform my process of copying along a line, maybe, actually, although that's y is straight up, that's not so interesting. Let's go maybe in an x-axis of 5. Now every 5 units, it'll put a new duplicate. In terms of the actual transform, that's helpful as long as you're working in a semi-straight line or in something that's predictable along those axes. However, one of the problems if you want your duplicates to actually go in a certain pattern, it's fairly difficult to do using just the scale, rotate, and translate operations. So what we have here is, if you see under Edit, Duplicate, Instantiate from Animation. Very useful. Either I can keyframe an animation and I'll have my duplicates created along that animation, or for example, maybe just make a curve animation instead of actual keyframing. So we got a curve here and we wish to have a lot of arrows along this curve. Let's take that bump out because that's sort of a little bit unaesthetic, isn't it really? Okay, there we go. So let's just create that with the path animation. So set path, we want it linear, we want it tangent. Say okay, it's gonna hit that. And we want the arrows to go along it, so maybe we'll go, oops, Y. Okay, so now it's going along. Really, this arrow will be. Now, we can just go ahead and hit that Edit, Duplicate, Instantiate from Animation, but if we just say OK, it's going to take every 10th frame, it's going to create an arrow. And we don't really know if that's good or not. So we can either sort of do a trial error and just keep hitting OK and then undoing until we find something that's good, or we can use the ghosting features of XSI. So basically make sure that the ghosting is on in our scene. There we go. Make sure that ghosting is on in the actual viewport. We'll go in there. And finally, hit our display options and actually enter the ghosting. So what we want to do is we want to say, well, we're working for 100 frames, so 100 frames after. And now we have the step value. So for example, if we choose every 10th frame, we see, okay, that would have been very close together, probably too close together to be quite right. So let's just increase that a little bit. And then we can see, okay, that's a little bit better, maybe every 14th frame. What's more is, of course, we could edit the animation, and the ghosting will reflect exactly what I've changed in order to match it up so that my instances will look perfect. So let's just unselect that so that it doesn't have to calculate it every single step, and we'll just go to Duplicate Instantiate. From Animation, we say every 14th step we said was good, and hit OK. And now it'll create a copy every 14th step. Now finally, of course, obviously I did not deform the arrows by the curve, so they're just sort of straight off there using a tangent, but that's okay. One other thing that's worth mentioning in the Duplicate Instantiate is just as easily we could also just do instances rather than duplicates, in this case especially, seeing as I'm not actually changing the topology. On instances, one other important point is that you can actually scale, rotate, and translate them as long as you're not changing the physical topology. So you can make items smaller or bigger or in different spaces or rotated them around, but you cannot actually change the surface of them. Finally, we have a couple little options down there at the bottom that I'd like to go into. Let's just delete all this nonsense right here, and let's just reset the transforms on this fella here. So let's say I wish to have my arrow here, and we're just going to rotate it along like so, and like yay, and something like that. I don't know, I'm just going to point it in a direction. And now we wish to have an exact symmetrical copy of that. All we have to do is go into Duplicate Instantiate, Duplicate Symmetry, select the axis that we wish to symmetrize it across. We have various options such as freezing negative scaling. So if you're building a skeleton, you're building something that you need to be able to animate correctly, you can freeze off the negative scaling or not. And you can also copy across constraints. If you're going to have a constraint system and you wish to have that on the other side as well, that will copy across. And you'll notice that it'll now create a correct symmetrical copy of that. Very useful, again, for building complex systems with lots of objects and then just duplicating across a plane. You can also find that option under the skeleton menu here. If you go right here and do Duplicate Symmetry, you'll find that there. Finally, one last thing is duplicate using geometry approximation. That's especially for a polygon mesh. Basically, if I create an object here that has subdivision surfaces on it, let's just grab that guy here, and I wish to have a copy of that, but not using the geometry approximation, like I have here. So if we look at this object, go down to my poly, add one level of subdivision surface to it, but I wish to have the exact subdivision mesh. What I can do is actually go in here and hit Duplicate Instantiate, Duplicate using geometry approximation, and it will create a duplicate of this object without any history back to the original, with the exact mesh topology of the subdivision surface.